Uh, Good morning, everyone. Francis, can I just confirm you can hear me, please?
Yes, David. Yeah.
Okay, I think we should get started. We got over 50 people on the call. So good morning, everyone, and welcome to today's Chief Audit Executives Forum. My name is David Leahy, and I'm pleasure to invite you all to a 1.5-hour session this morning. Just to remind you all, we are being recorded. We'll make this recording available to everybody on our distribution list for the Chief Audit Executives Forum. For those of you who haven't joined a previous forum webinar in the past, this is your forum. KPMG is giving you a platform as Chief Audit Executives and internal auditors within organizations here in East Africa to listen to guest speakers that we provide on an international basis on topics that are very important to you and your organizations as we work through this new normal post-pandemic and try our best to provide continuous value added to the organization from the internal audit function. We have a number of guest speakers, you can see the agenda in front of you. I'm giving the opening remarks this morning. Nancy Mosa, my colleague, who's a partner that does a lot of work in cyber and technology and business resilience, is on leave this week. So I'm jumping in, filling in for her to do the opening remarks. And I hope to come back later in the conversation and run the Q&A. If you have any questions, please put them in the chat box or the Q&A functionality at the bottom of your screen. Ask questions throughout the presentations. We do have somebody who will be taking those questions and directing them to the best person to answer your question. And people may be answering questions during the 1.5-hour time that we're spending together as well. Please make it interactive. We get the most out of it when you're asking questions. Usually the questions you're asking, others are thinking that same question. So please do that. And if I don't get back online towards the end of this session, I actually have to jump off to join an audit committee meeting at 9:30. Please let us know what topics you would like us to discuss going forward. Again, this is your forum. We're just using KPMG's just the platform for you to have your discussions. So without further ado, I'm going to pass it to a colleague of mine from South Africa. She's a partner in our technology area, Anashika, and she's going to take us through what she sees from some insights from the industry itself, the emerging risks, and what is the future of cyber and BCM. So over to you. Thank you.
Thanks, David. Morning, everyone. Hope you've had a good start to your morning. Thanks for the introduction. So my name is Nashikta Angat. I'm a partner at KPMG Technology Assurance. I currently also head up continuity and resilience for KPMG South Africa. Also, one of my portfolios is president of the BCI Southern Africa chapter. So the BCI is the Business Continuity Institute. It's headquartered in the UK, and there are chapters globally, each country. And I've got the good fortune of being the president for the South African chapter. The BCI basically sets standards and guidelines, good practices for business continuity, and it's a supporting function providing support throughout the year as a member and also as non-members. So that's basically me. Also have a bit of awards through the BCI. I won the BCI Industry Personality in 2016, and then in 2019, Continuity and Resilience Consultant. Many of you may have heard of the good practice guidelines. So usually business continuity professionals align to a standard called ISO 22301. And the good practice guidelines is based on the standard. So there was a version update in 2018, and I was actually quite fortunate enough to be part of the team that updated the document. So if you ever look at the document, make sure to look out for my name. It's quite an exciting initiative that I was involved in. And I hope you have a sense of being in some capable and good hands in terms of going through this topic. So if we can just move on to the next slide. Usually I start off most of my presentations with this slide because I think there's a lot of terminology related to business continuity and resilience, and it can get quite confusing. So I think with everyone on the call, being from an audit perspective or background, I thought I'd just touch on this. So I'm not sure of everybody's level of awareness. So I think this will give us a good foundation to start on. So the top half of the diagram relates to business activity, and the lower half refers to IT activity or business, IT functions. So we're going to take just an incident, an unplanned event that occurs, and you'll see on the diagram, there's a spark in the middle, which refers to the incident. I'll just use an example of a fire because that's probably the easiest one to work with. And when there's an incident, the first thing that happens is a lot of activity in a short space of time, very quickly. And this relates to your emergency response. And your emergency response is calling the ambulance, calling the fire brigade, getting people out to safety. And it really is just engaging with your authorities around emergency response. And here you have an emergency response team that deals with this activity. And the emergency response team is usually your facilities, physical security, health and safety, and we refer to them broadly as the emergency response team. And there's usually a plan, like an evacuation plan and other such plans to support that phase of activity. The next phase is crisis management, which actually starts very closely along the lines of when emergency response starts. And your crisis management team is your strategic team, your C-level execs, very senior levels of management that get involved in this phase. So here, the situation is analyzed, damage assessment performed and obtained from the emergency response team. And the strategic team has information to make decisions about assessing whether the incident actually can be considered a disaster and whether the business recovery plans need to be invoked. So if it's declared a disaster, you move on to your business recovery plans. And here you have your business recovery teams that support those plans. So this is where you actually start recovering business operations, your day-to-day operations. And here it's middle management who basically then, who knows most about the business that get very involved. Similarly, you have on the other side of the diagram, similar phases. So you have your network disaster recovery. So and your IT disaster recovery, emergency response, very similar. But I think it's important to separate the two because there's been over many, many years, a lot of misconception that business continuity is an IT responsibility, but it's actually a business responsibility and IT is an enabler. They have to work together because I don't think there's any organizations these days that work completely isolated from IT. Usually IT is an enabler of an organization. So I think you must have heard emergency response, crisis management, business continuity, it all sounds the same, but there is slight differences between each of those terms. So now that I've gone through that, I'll move on to the next slide. This is just a life cycle of a business continuity management life cycle. So it's taken out of the Good Practice Guidelines 2018, the BCI guidelines, and it summarizes if you were on the BC journey and you wanted to establish business continuity in the organization, how would you go about it? So the first phase is the circle around the entire diagram, which is policy and BC program management. So this is where you're establishing your governance, you're assigning responsibilities and roles, you're setting the policies and setting the tone from the top. The next phase is analysis. And this is where you do information gathering. So to get to the end result, which is a plan, you need to analyze your business. And you do it through a business impact assessment and risk assessments. And all of that information is then used to design your strategies and your plans. What's important from analysis is defining your recovery time objectives and recovery point objectives. So recovery time is when there's a disaster, how soon do you need to recover? And recovery point is how much of data basically are you willing to lose? Can you recover from yesterday's backup, or do you need real-time data available as of when the system went down, for example? So that was analysis. Then design, I mentioned you designing the strategies. Implementation is actually implementing the response structures, the teams, the plans. And then very important is validation. So once you have these plans in place, it's only really as good as what everyone knows in those plans. I always say, if there's a fire, you're not going to grab a thick document and start paging through, but you're actually going to expect people to have gone through the document and know how to respond. So here it's where you exercise the plans, and then embedding the culture of business continuity into the organization. So in everything you do, you think about what do I need to consider from a business continuity perspective? If you're implementing a new system, if there's any significant changes in the organization, it just becomes a way of thinking. So what's important for a CAE in looking at this life cycle is that you may not necessarily need to develop all of this, but in terms of auditing it, these are the things you'd look for. So you'd look for a policy, you'd look that a business impact analysis was performed, reviewing of the plans, that the plans were exercised. And I guess at various stages, not all organizations will start from the beginning. You might have organizations that have plans that need updating, but I think it's a nice way of just putting everything together. All right, and then if you move on, getting into what the focus area of my presentation is on, which is actually industry insights, emerging risks, and just the future of business continuity and trends that we've seen. So the BCI perform an analysis every year and issue a report called the Horizon Scan Report. And this is the report that has recently been produced in 2021 for 2020. What's interesting about this is it tells you what are the top risks and threats that has been indexed in prior years. And well, I don't have it up here, but basically in previous years, the number one risk has not been anything to do with pandemic. It's always been something to do with, IT, telecom outages, weather conditions. Cyber attack has been moving up throughout, as each year passes, it moves up on the list. But here you can see non-occupational diseases like the pandemic has been the number one risk for obvious reasons. Health incidents, safety incidents, IT and telecom outages, cyber attack and data breaches, extreme weather, lack of talent and key skills, supply chain disruption, regulatory changes, and interruption to utility supplies. So it just gives you a view of when you're planning for the audits in future months to come, what are some of the areas you should be looking at? So pandemic is going to be a number one risk. In terms of health incidents, what is there that you can look at an audit to determine whether this risk is sufficiently mitigated? And I guess it's a good sense of what to, using the previous year's data, what to project for upcoming years. If we move on to the next slide, this is based on 2020 results. They've summarized what 2021 and future years will look like. And you'll see by the index ratings, it's quite high index ratings. The pandemic is still going to continue to be a number one risk and everything that comes with the pandemic. So that'll go on for a little while. And you'll see cyber attack and data breach. So I can tell you just from the discussions I've had with clients, what we've seen in the news, cyber attack has become so prevalent. We recently had a call with a client who said, we haven't really looked at cyber in the past and it's important now. But it actually has been important for a very long time. It's always been a risk, but it's just become so much more intense in the last year. And I guess that's why this webinar has been centered around cyber resilience. Moving on to the next slide, I'm just keeping an eye on my time. So I want to focus more of my presentation on lessons from the pandemic. So in terms of the future of business continuity, the future is based on some of the biggest incidents that we've experienced in recent years. And without a doubt, the pandemic has been the #1 incident. So looking at the lessons from the pandemic, there's been some changes in the way people are doing things and what's been projected from a BCM perspective. So the #1, or not #1, but just one of the points that I wanted to chat about was risk registers. I think everyone would agree that the pandemic probably was on very, very few, if any, risk registers, and more so in Africa. And it's obviously alluded to the fact that there needs to be more thorough risk assessments performed. So usually you'd have a workshop and you just talk about risks, and you put together a risk register. More mature organizations will use some sort of tools and techniques, but horizon scanning has become quite important. If we had sat back and said, okay, this is happening overseas, and maybe this is something we need to start thinking about, some of the strategies that were implemented could have been implemented a little earlier to be more proactive. SWOT analysis, so looking at your strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats. So using very different sorts of techniques to identify threats that we may not have considered in the past. So for example, even in terms of opportunities, the pandemic has changed business models to an extent where it's introduced opportunities, and those opportunities may have continuity risks related to it. The ever popular example of Uber and digital disruption, and the fact that the taxi industry was crippled because Uber came about, and basically it was a continuity risk that many had not considered. Single points of failures, looking at from an IT perspective, a network diagram, if you're a manufacturing organization, whatever the case is, looking at some of these things to put together a really comprehensive risk register, and not just touching the surface on things. Obviously, you'd apply the impact and likelihood to each risk to make sure that you're not putting everything on the risk register and not considering how relevant it is to your organization. Remote working, there's always been talk of working remotely and this agile work environment, but it only really kicked into gear with the pandemic. And a lot of business continuity plans and recovery plans had not catered for remote working. So previously you looked at a DR site, you have a primary and secondary. And now a lot of organizations have actually decided that they don't need a secondary site where you actually have people working from the secondary site. You might have it for IT services, but from a secondary site perspective, it might be people just work from home rather than go through the DR site. Then collaboration tools. So technology was lacking to a certain extent. Organizations that didn't have collaboration tools and made use of virtual applications like Teams and Zoom and things like that were falling behind. Infrastructure investments started plummeting. And I think that's going to continue for a while to come. At the same time, if you think about what this might look like, I remember back in the day, we used to have conference calls where you have some people sitting in another office, for example, and some people working from home. And you have that uncomfortable, please, can you move closer to the speaker? Sorry, I can't hear you. Can you repeat that? So it was a bit clumsy, and it works when everybody is working from home. You've got better connectivity and you can hear people more clearly rather than sharing off one microphone. But I guess time will tell if that's going to be something that is going to be happening in the future. From a resilience perspective, the rest of the world have caught on to the concept of continuity moving to resilience. So that means continuity is something that's, you just focused on recovering. So you want to bounce back, but resilience is bounce back better. You want to use your continuity plans and your recovery plans to actually see if you can do things better. So if you're going to recover something, you might as well put in all of the improvements that you always wanted to in doing that. Also, BCM professionals and the discipline itself. So those professionals that actually were heard and came to the front when it was when it was dealing with the pandemic and navigating the crisis, those who took a key role in that whole process will continue to be an important part of an organization. Those professionals who shied away and were not part of the crisis committees and not part of the decision making have actually raised a question as to whether you need a BC professional. And the other thing that's important about that is that the pandemic has provided a false sense of security. So I'm jumping to number 8 a little bit. It's created a false sense of security. Everybody's on the same playing fields. And a lot of people think that because you've been through the pandemic and you've tested your plans, that your plans are foolproof and that you can handle any disaster from there. But it is a very regulated disaster because you've got regulations that say, what you can do, what you can't do, when you're allowed to return to work, curfews and things like that. But if you were in this disaster alone, if you just think about just your organization and everybody else were not dealing with the same thing, it would be very different. You'd have to make decisions and not be told what to do. And so testing is also important. You need to have a good idea of whether other scenarios, your leadership team are geared up to deal with other scenarios. And it also means you need to be more proactive than reactive. Then supply chains. So this was a big lesson from the pandemic. We had to look at using alternate suppliers and there was just so much to do with international supply chains not being available quickly. And what we've seen is also that contracting at KPMG alone, I think I had about 7 of our customers or clients request BC arrangements from KPMG to confirm that, we handle data safely, and if there's a disaster, how does it impact the client itself? And it just shows that this is the way everyone is going. That's the thinking. ISO 22301 internationally is a standard that most vendors need to adopt before anyone will work with the vendor. And we're quite far behind. But I think simple things like making sure that in your contracts, you request that your vendors have BC arrangements and you have KPIs, those kind of things which will make sure that you've got some supply chain safety guards. So I see we're running out of time, so I'm going to time just flies by, but quickly go through it. So in terms of what we see coming up, so those that choose to be unvaccinated, you can expect there'd be a lot of lawsuits, reputational management that needs to be considered. And it's a very sensitive topic because anything with respect to health and safety will be sensitive. And there's a case in South Africa where Momentum, one of the insurance companies, repudiated a claim. And it was for something where somebody passed away and it wasn't related to the actual illness that was in question. And while the organization had the legal license, or what they had presented was accurate and was by the book, contractually sound, the public interest and the social aspect of it resulted in the company changing their decision. So reputational is going to be huge. You've got to balance legal license and social license. Travel passports, hybrid working, it's going to continue. I think there's been a lot about that, so I'll skip on. Global response strategies. So what organizations that have a global presence found was that each country had a different way of dealing with the crisis. There was no consistency. The messaging wasn't consistent. And so they had to quickly put together things in terms of how they're going to create a consistent response. So those organizations are now working on response strategies and how to deal with it globally. Climate and social media risk. So climate risk, we've seen flooding, we've seen tons of disasters throughout the world. And again, that's going to be a #1 risk. Social media, anything you say, you make, once it's out there, you can't take it back. And so then it links back to reputational risk. Technology, so a lot of software has gone contactless because of the pandemic, and analytics, IoT, robotics, cloud, all of those technology introduce a certain element of risk as well. So emerging technology risk needs to be considered. Certification, so ISO 22301, more organizations will request their vendors to have that, and professionals need to have it as well. Testing and simulations, we've seen a huge rise in requests from clients to test other scenarios. And because everyone's working virtually, you can't have a classroom-based simulation. So we use tools like a 4DI tool, where it's a platform that basically allows you to have more realistic scenarios presented and more forms of media that can be presented. Early warning systems. So here, crisis management always talks about early warning systems, and we were quite late with the pandemic. So it's putting in place things that will trigger us into gear. Traditional approaches. So I know there's a lot that's going to be discussed on cyber resilience, but we've seen with the recent cyber attacks that a lot of organizations, had a primary cloud and a secondary cloud, and there was actually ransomware that propagated across the cloud environment and left the organizations, basically crippled in that they didn't have an offline third copy to recover from, and they had to basically rebuild. So air gapping and some of these concepts are going to become quite big. And then e-commerce, many retailers had to adopt e-commerce quite quickly. It's also led to diversification and opportunities, which I spoke about earlier. And that's basically what needs to be considered going forward. So as a CAE, what basically you can consider. So reviewing and testing resilience plans against leading practices. More importantly is testing. I think you've got a lot of plans probably in place, but testing it and testing different scenarios. Reviewing recovery strategies. So strategies will need to be updated based on everything we've just spoken about, and it needs to be reflected. Reviewing and testing cyber incident response plans. Consider simulations for testing all of the plans. Supply chain resilience and vendor management reviews, and key person dependencies. So one of the risks of this pandemic is that a lot of key resources, key people have either been unavailable or passed away. And so now there's more emphasis on identifying key persons and putting into place some sort of succession planning. So it's quite a mouthful. I hope I managed to cover some key points that you may not have considered in the past. But I hope we have at least a few minutes for questions. Okay, I'm just looking at how do we align the role of risk quantification to have a working integrated risk management. So risk quantification, I think basically when you're looking at your risk assessments, it's your risk appetite. But what we also say with business continuity is you can't plan for every single type of disaster. There's too many that could happen. So what we rather focus on is how do you plan for impact to or the loss or unavailability of buildings and infrastructure, equipment, technology, human resources, and third parties. So I think just very high level, that's what I would look at from that perspective. Most organizations plan for staff to work from home, but lack questionnaire to ask if staff are really ready and can deliver. So at the moment in South Africa, I can tell you most organizations are now working on a return to work policy. So with the vaccination rollout, we expect herd immunity in maybe the next 3 to 5 months, which would lead us into around December, where we expect another wave. So basically returning to work in around February next year, and it varies per organization. So there's also talk of mandatory vaccination policy. So depending on the industry you're in, you can request that your resources are vaccinated because of them being, social distancing is not possible, for example. And if they choose not to, you can actually dismiss those staff. So I think the question about whether staff are ready, they're going to have to possibly just get on board with whatever the organization decides. But it is obviously preferred that you start getting your staff ready. So if you know that's the way you're going, you still have time to get them ready. Okay. Okay, do we have a guide or framework on the frequency of BIA exercises? So the BIA is roughly, I would say, is reviewed on a yearly basis. So depends as well. If you have significant changes within your organization, then you'd need to do it more regularly. It also depends on how often changes occur within an organization, how flexible, adaptable they are. So the BCI and the GPG and the ISO standards don't actually say anything about you need to do it once a year or twice a year or every quarter. Basically, it's up to the organization to determine how often they need to, and then you need to build it into your policy. So if your policy says every year, then that's basically what you need to do. But I would say at least every year, review the BIA. If there's a need to reperform or update, then you'd need to do that. But it doesn't need to be an entire exercise every year. So that's basically how I would cover it. Okay, so I think I've covered all of the questions and I'm over time, apologize for that. But thank you very much. I hope that I managed to capture at least a few points, thought-provoking points for you to consider. Otherwise, I'm sure my details will be shared and happy to have any discussions if you would like to. Thanks and enjoy the rest of the presentation.
Thank you, Nashikta. What a presentation. I think it's not easy to come after her. Very good presentation covering most of the aspects that we would have in terms of BCM. We are just going to have a small poll just to assess in terms of BCM awareness and implementation in your current organizations. So I'll ask the team to run the poll, and then we'll probably see the responses that we are receiving and align the presentation going forward. As we run the poll, my name is Paul Kenyere. I'm a manager within KPMG East Africa. I work within advisory and also within the operations department as the National IT Security Officer Assistant. I've been with KPMG for 10 years. Of those 10 years, 8 have been essentially implementing BCMs for various organizations across Africa and sectors. So I've implemented BCM for telcos, government institutions, service industries, e.g. police and even security firms. So in terms of the coverage of today, mine today was to just highlight on some of the key risks that we are seeing emerging in terms of business continuity. And one of them is this presentation essentially was supposed to be on business resilience. I felt the need that we have a team which is consistent with the current emerging risk, which is, of course, one of them being cyber, and we have Sam Alcatel. And we also have automation, and which is the future, and we have Kelvin Karedi to deal with that. So on to our first poll question. Does the organization have a business continuity management plan? So as we can see the results, 88% say yes, 12% say no, not very bad. I wonder about the 12% in the current times we live. The next question. Does your audit plan include business continuity management and cyber response plan as part of their items to be audited? Goes to the emerging risks. 42% of the participants. I just put off my video so that we don't affect the network of those people who are working from home, and be considerate. %. Continue voting. So we had 50%, 76% say that their organization or their audit schedules do scope BCM and cyber. Again, 21% of you do not scope BCM and cyber. And we will see your mandate as a chief executive audits when it comes to BCM, according to various standards and even regulations if you're working for a financial institution where there are clear guidelines on what should be done when it comes to auditing BCMs in various organizations. So yeah, 79% of you say yes, 21% say no. Next question, please. Okay, does your internal audit team have the right competency and experience to assess or audit the following areas? The BCP, the business continuity plans, crisis and emergency management plan, IT disaster recovery and cyber response plan, business impact analysis, and automated BCM. So within the team that is working for you in terms of audit, do they have this competence, which are very critical if you're going to give your business a 360 view in terms of continuity of all aspects of the operations and services? So I'm getting some of the above at 58%. I'm getting all of the above at 40%, which is very impressive. And I'm getting none of the above at 7%. Okay, I would assume the 7%, maybe we outsource this service to maybe a third party, which is also okay. If you feel investing in a resource to audit BCM and this particular area is not worth it, then you can go for a third party to assist you in that. Okay, over to the next question. Okay, that's the same question, sorry. Did the audit team assess the effectiveness of your COVID response plan as part of performance evaluation, and were the findings reported to the board? So these questions tries to assess whether your audit plans are dynamic enough to assess emerging risk. COVID, initially, many organizations did not have a pandemic response plan. So, but they were forced to do so because of the pandemic. And therefore, as a BCM auditor, I would have expected that we have gone and assessed what has been put in place for adequacy and whether it's actually working and achieving the objective that was set. So 57% say no, that they did not assess. 44% they are saying they assessed. Okay, so over the next few slides, I will go through some elements to try and answer those questions that we have just gone through. Essentially, we'll go through some definitions, and then probably from there, I'll do a small poll, no, not necessarily a poll, but I will report on a poll that we have done previously, actually two of them, one on the talent agenda and the other one on the CEO outlook. And then I'll tell you why is it important to perform a BCM audit and scope resilience in your organization. I'll tell you the competencies that are there in the market, or what is required for you to be comfortable that your team can actually assess your organizational continuity. I'll also highlight some of the areas. I know Nashikta has highlighted most of the areas that you should be looking for in terms of the audit going forward. I will also tell you in terms of what is a new normal. What are we seeing, okay? Initially, we knew we were working from office locations. Now we have a situation where we are working from home. Then what does BCM of working from home entail, or a hybrid kind of module work? So therefore, we'll be talking into that and how to get there. So I will highlight on the way forward on how can we get to the new normal. So what is business continuity? In a nutshell, business continuity is the ability of an organization to continue delivery of products and services. So those are the services that you offer to your customers within acceptable timeframes and predefined capacity during a disruption, okay? Most organizations right now are operating within what we are called acceptable timeframes and predefined capacity. Nobody is operating at 100%, or very few organizations might be operating at 100%, but it's because they planned well and they identify that for us to actually offer our services, we require to be back at 100%. Some of them think that the critical services would be 30%, and that's what we are talking about, predefined capacity. You have to define that prior to the disruption. And what is cyber resilience? Okay, and cyber resilience is a component of business continuity management. The reason why we are defining it here is because it's critical. Many organizations are now relying on IT to perform most of their critical processes. And therefore, IT becomes so integral in terms of processes that we have even to have a specific response plan for their recovery of the network and the IT system themselves. And therefore, cyber resilience is the organization's ability to recover from a successful cyber attack with as little business disruption, regulatory conflict, and reputational impact as possible. For the IT is the ability to recover IT systems and telecommunication despite outages or losses. So within the three definitions, one of them, the business continuity talks about continuing, the other two talks about recovering. It's critical that in IT we recover. We can't continue in a new normal. We must recover what we had. For the business, we can say we are going to continue offering services as we try to recover those that were lost. So in terms of the poll that we conducted or the survey, so in terms of how is COVID reshaping the talent agenda, we wanted to understand what is the impact of COVID to organizations from an individual perspective, and from an organization perspective, the impact of COVID to the talent agenda. We know the COVID has affected our people, and therefore I want to understand what is the organization facing in terms of that area. We know many organizations are facing issues with mental well-being, lack of motivation, drop in productivity, attritions. And therefore, we asked organizations and individuals, how would you rate the effectiveness of your organization dealing with the impact of the pandemic on the business? So 59% felt that they were somewhat effective. They weren't ready as such, but they did well. 26% felt that highly effective, well prepared, and 15% felt that this was not well handled. Okay. So in terms of the participants from the sectors, the consulting sector was quite huge, because you see now within the consulting sector, you're selling knowledge, and there are a lot of workforce in terms of human resources. Financial sectors followed closely in terms of the sample size. In terms of the conclusion from the poll is that one thing is for sure, that failing to plan is planning to fail. Those organizations that planned well in terms of having BCMs around the people element or the human resource element were able to overcome most of the impact of COVID or the negative impact of COVID. There is need to drive real-time planning for work schedules. We could see we were forced to work on a day-to-day basis. We make plans on a daily-to-daily basis because you don't know what are the dynamics going to be. In terms of HR services, how are you going to continue offering them? Remember, HR services used to be more or less physical when I want to talk to a HR person. Now, how are you going to deliver these services and also be able to understand what your staff is going through or those? So there is need to redefine that into a new normal. The other survey, which I'll go through quickly, is the CEO outlook. And the key findings from this, we wanted to understand what are the CEO seeing in terms of the market with COVID being a key factor in terms of the continuity of various organizations. So what we are getting from the CEO is they're saying government and vaccination rates are driving decision-making, which is the current situation as we can see. We are also seeing that cyber security is now a top concern for most CEOs, which is what we would expect. And then we also ask the CEOs in terms of when will your company return to normal course of business? 19% think that business will change forever and therefore will not return to normal. Some of them think that we will return by fall or winter of 2021. And 29% think that we will return somewhere in 2022. Nobody surely knows, but as you can clearly see what the CEOs are saying. In terms of how they responded to the pandemic, some of them said that in terms of going forward, they will increase HR resources that will be dedicated to employees. Also, there is uptake in terms of digital collaboration and communication tools. I think we have seen that across board for various organizations. And there is also the element of now, in terms of attracting talent, and in terms of how will we go about that process and ensure that it's foolproof. So that most of them are saying they are going to implement virtual interviews to potential employees. In terms of the steps they took in terms of managing the pandemics, they increased visibility in terms of leaders with employees, greater focus in terms of regulatory compliance, the guidelines from government, MOH. So there was focus on that. Increased employee communications. I think that's something we saw within various organizations, and additional resources in terms of tools for employees to collaborate. Okay. Okay, so we move to the gist of it. What is the role and mandate of audit in business resilience? And this is captured well in the ISO 22301, the 2019 edition, clause 9.2 on internal audit, which clearly defines what is required in terms of the audit. I will refer to bullet number 4, report to the board of directors the effectiveness of business continuity management. In any organization, the role of continuity or the mandate of continuity of any organization lies on the board. The board is the one which will ensure that in case of any disaster, that organization will continue. Even the prudential guidelines for 14 of CBK in terms of and regulatories, they clearly put this mandate to the board. Now, for the board to be comfortable that that organization can continue, they rely on the auditor. And therefore, the auditor needs to be well equipped to assure the board that the BCM practices in place in that organization can be able to withstand any kind of disaster or disruption. If you can't assure them that, then they will be forced to invest. Now, what is the importance of audit in business continuity planning? Number one, in any organization, any initiative is supposed to be aligned to a specific strategy. So BCM is one of those, and it is key reason is the organization to remain available so that it achieves its strategic objectives. Without that audit, you can never know whether the BCM is achieving its intended objectives. So audit is very important in terms of aligning that. And it also highlights the risk of not having BCM and evaluate BCPN, DRP during formulation. What do we mean by this? The boards need to be aware in terms of, because the internal audit function is required to report directly to the board. What are the areas of risk that might hinder my organization from continuing in case of a disaster? And that will go to both the IT element and the disaster recovery element. Okay. On the third bullet, again, the audit team is the one which is going to put the implementers on toes in terms of updating the BCM. Okay. Once they are aligned to what the policy says, it is also the auditors who will go out there and look for continual improvement areas to come and audit them against those, so that they keep improving, and the continual improvement cycle of an organization continues to be there. Again, evaluating business continuity readiness and reporting to the board of management. I think we have talked much into that. So over to the next slide. So what are the key competencies that or standard that we ascribe to when it comes to BCM? I think they have highlighted a few here, or we have highlighted a few here. Some of them have not been highlighted. I know there is something like MBCI, and I saw Nashikta is the president of the South African chapter. So, but of course, there is the 22301, there is the lead auditor, there is the lead implementer. There are a number of regulatory requirements that are aligned to BCM, but you will find that most of them will go back to ISO 22301, or they borrow much from that. So if you look at what we see at the industry, is ISO 22301 is the key standard that you need to align to when it comes to business continuity management. There are other standards. For example, the BCM Institute of Singapore have their own way of undertaking BCM, but they don't vary. You will find that in that case, the risk assessment comes before the business impact analysis, and there is a whole school of thought to it. Expertise in business continuity. in terms of expertise, there are various components about BCM. There is crisis management, there is emergency response, which deals with people. There is, of course, cyber. So if you don't have the right team, you might give an assurance that your organization is okay in terms of BCM. You miss out on a key component, which might not sit well if a disaster occurs and your organization is unable to continue, and you had given that assurance that they are okay. Understanding IT recovery, like I've said, automation is critical going forward, and understanding also emerging risk. Like I've said, continual improvement is based on the auditor's capability of staying afloat with the current insights in terms of risk. So here we are highlighting the top 19 COVID-19 risks that there was a survey to it, and from KPMG Belgium. And this is what came out. As you can see, most of them have been mentioned by Nashikta during the previous slides. Business continuity, crisis management, and emergency response plan is one of them. And of course, third parties and reputation remains still significant. So in terms of business continuity, which are the areas that you should consider going forward, or the emerging risks that you should be considered on your upcoming audits, or which are the areas you should be telling your audit teams to focus on in terms of continuity? So in terms of governance, this relates to people. So it talks to the policy and how the policy is reviewed the board. So that's the ownership of the board. And then are there teams that are supposed to deal with BCM and updating them? Are those teams aligned to specific targets? Are there people who are dealing with suppliers? Are there people who are dealing with IT, pandemic? Those teams are critical to be defined. And then in terms of training, are they properly trained when it comes to their roles in that? Operational crisis management. Sorry about that. We are looking in terms of the operations of a business. What are you supposed to look at? Right now, the pandemic is affecting our people. So crisis management becomes in terms of what are we communicating to our people, our third parties, our customers, and the government. So crisis management needs to be exercised, and they need to be proper and approved. Training of employees is another critical element now that they are working from home. And then the COVID-19 response plan needs to be assessed. Right now, you will note there are in many organizations, we have redundant processes. There was a process which was being done manually before the pandemic. Right now, it has evolved to an automated process due to the pandemic's impact, but we still retain it in our documentation and SOP, standard operating procedures, as a process. So there is need to assess those. In terms of people, we need to assess in terms of what are the mental health initiatives that HR is taking. Is the organization trying to ensure that our staff are vaccinated? Protocols in terms of aligning with the government, and facilitation of working from home. In terms of supply chain, I think Nashikta mentioned, what we need to be looking at is as we engage vendors or as our organization are engaging vendors, are they embedding BCP clauses on those clauses, requiring vendors to have or suppliers to have BCP clauses? They are very critical services, for example, within IT, that if the vendor does or the supplier does not have a BCP and they fail, it will come to affect your services or what you offer to your customers. And then also there is a requirement that you can audit that BCP or send someone to audit on your behalf for the comfortability of that. The other strategies, again, we are seeing is pre-qualification of vendor or onboarding of 2 suppliers or 3 suppliers for redundancy purposes. For technology, I will not go into it much because Samuel is coming in closely to deal with cyber. But one of the key elements that you will see there is just look at the emerging risks and deal with them properly. Moving on. So what is the new normal going to look like? Now, how are we going to get to the new normal in terms of BCP? Okay, so we are not going to go back to the normal that we had. We are going to go to a new normal. For example, now we are going to be our staff are going to be working from home. And what are some of the risks that we are seeing that are associated with working from home? I will give you an example. Physical security. Has the organization considered the physical security of some of the critical employees, for example, who work in finance and all those departments, that someone can actually come to their home and hold them at ransom and force them to do transactions? There is also in terms of security of, in terms of continuity, in terms of power. So you're finding many organizations, and this has affected me on a couple of instances. When you lose power and then you are unable to perform your services, maybe there was a critical service that you needed to perform, and then you don't have power. So you're finding organizations, some of them are sending UPSs to those people who perform critical services within the organization. In terms of perimeter security, you're finding that most organizations, yes, you're sitting somewhere in a home network. The security of that home network is not as strong as we're sitting within an organization. Yes, there might be a VPN network, but we'll tell you that that outside network also puts you at risk. So that what is the solution to that? We are seeing the onboarding of enterprise-grade management tools or mobility tools, as opposed to taking tools designed for individuals. You take for organization because they come with security features. So once you start thinking about the future, then you can replan and do your BIA properly so that you are now aligned to a new objective. And then from there, now have a recovery or implementation plan, or how are you going to get to the new normal? Okay, how are you going to address the risks that you're seeing? So going forward, what I can leave you with is scope BCM and scope it properly. I always give this example where I went to audit one of our clients, and it's a banking institution. And when I was auditing, everything looked okay, except that I couldn't get the scripts or the screenshots of the script showing that actually during the DR simulation, that they moved services from the primary site to the DR site. Okay, it was very well written in Excel, and we moved from IPX to IPX. And for that, I gave a performance improvement area because I had loggerheads with the board and management saying that you cannot fail our BCM based on not seeing a screenshot, but you can see it's clearly reported. And afterwards, they had a disaster and were unable to actually recover within the timelines speculated because, one, the IT team actually chose to just change the IP address within the primary data center to show that if they are the ones at the DR. And therefore, users were just given a link and they thought they were working from the DR, but they were actually working from the primary. And that's what actually I came back and said, I had actually highlighted this issue, and therefore you cannot say I did not capture it. So scope BCM, scope it properly. Think of the emerging risks in terms of right now we are seeing what people are working from. What are the risks associated with that? And what should the organization do to address those? Cyber, someone will go into it. And then automation. We are seeing many organizations are adopting automation in terms of even BCM. How are you going to audit automated BCM? Okay. And are there single points of failure within those? Okay. And therefore, with that, I think I have come to a conclusion of my presentation. Over to you, Samuel. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Paul. Dear Chief Audit Executives, by way of introduction, my name is Samuel Kecha, manager within the cyberspace here at KPMG. We'll take you through cyber resilience, just to make you understand what cyber resilience is all about. Cyber resilience versus cybersecurity. What's the difference? What are the similarities? We'll also take you through why cyber resilience is an important factor within your organization, also on how to come up with the cyber resilience program, the IT security trends to consider, and the lessons learned from cyber breaches. So if you may allow me, let me switch off my video just to sustain the network connectivity.
Samuel, you could be speaking on mute.
Sorry. Thank you for that. So cyber resilience, what is it? So cyber resilience is taking the mitigation of risks from cyber attackers and really looking at it through the lens of resilience. For example, how do you not only make it difficult for the attackers to take you down, but also how do you intend to bounce back quickly? And that's a key part of resilience, in that you accept that you're going to see a compromise of some sort. And through your proactivity, you're doing as much as possible to put the attackers on their back foot. So the main aim is just to ensure that you make it as hard as possible for the attackers or the perpetrators to not be able to breach through your security perimeter. So cyber resilience is all about an organization's ability to continue operations, to sustain, be successful in the middle of cyber attacks, right? So now to the next layer, that is on cyber resilience versus cyber security, and what's the difference? Well, I know a majority of you have had this question on the back of their minds for a long time, and just to demystify these, cyber resilience involves response. The organization's ability to recover from a cyber attack with little impact. As you all know, cyber resilience also involves giving organizations the realistic point of view, in that a cyber attack can happen at any time, keeping in consideration the investments made in protecting assets. While also cybersecurity, on the other hand, majorly focuses on defense in depth. This approach basically involves applying barriers such as multiple security solutions, whereby you have organizations with multiple layers of firewalls, endpoint security, and such and so forth, just to protect the organization's assets, but it's still not a guarantee that it will prevent attackers from getting through the barriers put in place. And also that brings out another question of how to realize cyber resilience. As you all know, a majority of organizations within East Africa invest millions of shillings on cybersecurity solutions, of which a majority of the funds usually go to endpoint security controls. And then that brings out another question is, how much of this investment spent is truly effective and how much of it is truly lost? Usually from my conversations with CISOs within East Africa, it's always been a relative discussion, because you may see some people say yes, they may realize value, others see, yes, I have purchased multiple security solutions, but still they're not getting the value for money. And with that said, the default playbook and majority of organizations they put in place is to buy lots of tools, security applications, and antiviruses and EDR solutions, and they get this perception that they have achieved cyber resilience. Well, usually this approach usually doesn't work due to the universal law of security decay that I believe you all know, where critical controls rot over time. Right. Usually a company's security posture is put at risk when the security solutions and controls are piled onto devices. And not only do these critical controls decay over time to create insecure software, but employees also risk becoming insider threats where they remove cybersecurity software to improve their device performance. The end result is usually lack of visibility, and without visibility into exposures, our IT security professionals are usually left at the mercy of attackers. So now this brings me to my next question: how to come up with a cyber resilience program? Next slide, please. Yes. So the fundamental pieces in coming up with a cyber resilience program is still an evolving space, but first you have to start. The attackers will succeed, and you have to be ready for it. One can follow the showcased NIST approach in setting up a cyber resilience program, that basically observes the 5 critical domains that include identify, where an organization identifies her assets, protect, define security controls that are required to ensure that the assets are properly secured, detect, have teams in place that can be able to detect any anomalies within your environment, respond, have playbooks in place that appropriately address the anomalies that may occur within your IT environment, and recover. Now, this now narrows down to BCP. What are your plans? What are the plans put in place to ensure that your organization is now able to recover from a cyber attack? Secondly, you need to have that technical mindset that helps support it. You need to have the ability to detect any unusual activities that may take place within your organization systems. Organizations with a security operations center, for example, or have subscribed to a managed security services are at an advantage in detecting the unusual activities and proactively applying countermeasures to keep the attackers at the back foot. And lastly, for an organization to build an effective cyber resilience program, they must observe what I call cyber hygiene. And what do I mean by this? Many organizations are constantly trying their best to churn out technological products and services to their clients in order to meet their customers' demands. And in the process, they usually tend to not implement all security standards, as well as remediate the systems weaknesses that could be exploited one day. And as a result, these organizations accrue what I call a technical debt in an existing environment that attackers will constantly go for. And by reducing the technical debt, organizations are reducing the attack surfaces, thus helping them achieve cyber resilience. Next slide, please. On IT security trends to consider. All right. With the constantly changing cyber landscape, there is need to keep abreast with the IT security trends. So I'll quickly go through the 4 key trends that I opted to highlight today. So the first one being on managed threat detection and response services. So these services assist in extending the cybersecurity capabilities beyond preventive technologies to cater for threat detection, monitoring and response, thus preventing known attacks and detecting unknown attacks. Secondly, data security governance frameworks assist in providing the basis for establishment of a cost-effective data security program in line with the organization's business objectives, and to follow the legal data security regulations such as you all know, the Kenya Data Protections Act and the GDPR. Thirdly, on implementation of a GRC. So a GRC solution basically enables organizations to better manage risk, ensure compliance with regulations, reduce costs incurred due to installation of software to cater for corporate GRC management procedures. And lastly, on secure DevOps. Secure DevOps assures organizations of the implementation of security measures across each stage of the software development lifecycle, and also assists companies improve their compliance levels with regards to the regulatory laws such as the Kenya Data Protection Act and the GDPR through reduction in compliance costs. All right, next slide, please. On lessons learned from cyber breaches, especially around supply chain attacks. As you all know, supply chain attacks usually pose a critical risk within organizations. And so I'll quickly touch across the 4 supply chain attacks. So to start off with, we have the SolarWinds supply chain attack. This involved limited versions of the SolarWinds software that had been altered with a malicious code known as Sunburst. So this malicious code appeared to have been designed to provide the perpetrators a way to enter a customer's environment. If exploited, the perpetrators then had to avoid files and other security controls within the customer's environment. And the end result was data exfiltration. As you all know, data is now the new gold. Attackers are no longer hacking for money, but now hacking for data. Secondly is on Operation Soft Cell. So this was a worldwide campaign that targeted telecommunication providers worldwide. It involved an advanced persistent attack targeting global telecommunication providers with a focus on obtaining data of specific high-value targets and resulting in a complete takeover of the network. It was carried out by threat actors using tools and techniques commonly associated with Chinese affiliated threat actors. Sorry, I think the slide changed a bit. All right. Thirdly, it's an Operation Cloudhopper. This was a global cyber espionage campaign against MSPs, that is the managed service providers, who are usually tasked with managing customers' application, network, and system infrastructure. Majority of them were compromised in order to infiltrate the networks of these customers who were the actual targets. And then lastly, we have the target data breach that involved exposure of multiple credit card data from target customers. So what are the lessons learned from all these four examples provided? There is a need to understand the risks and dependencies in the supply chain, especially on threats and exposures associated with third parties. So whenever you're coming up with a cyber resilience program, it is important to ensure that you have an end-to-end visibility of your supply chain. That also includes your fourth and fifth providers, and also ensure that arrangements are in place to respond to your supply chain cyber attacks collectively. This can be done by ensuring that mechanisms are in place to respond to cyber attacks and taking lessons from previous cyber attacks. All right. And with that, I believe we can proceed to the next slide. Thank you all. I'll take this opportunity to welcome my colleague, Kelvin Karith. Kelvin, welcome.
Thank you very much, Samuel, for that. Good morning, everyone. My name is Kelvin Karith. I am a manager with KPMG East Africa practice. I've been working in the AI and innovation space for the last decade or so, and we'll be taking you through some of the considerations around AI and automation that can be of great importance for us as we consider the imperatives of business continuity and the entire business resilience spectrum. Having said that, allow me to please switch off the video just for purposes of our colleagues who may have bandwidth challenges, and we can continue. So you will agree with me, based on what we've heard in the previous sessions, that there's a lot of evolution in the environments that we operate in. Critical amongst those is not just the IT environment or what we'd call the applications environment. We are moving into a combination of users who are both IT savvy and business users who require certain IT capabilities that would be important across them delivering services in the different environments we are in. Secondly, there's a lot of shift between on-premise systems and cloud-based systems. The idea here being, as businesses are grappling with the requirement of continuity, a lot of them are trying to work with capabilities provided by the cloud. And that means there's a lot of privileged access to all this infrastructure and applications, whether through infrastructure as a service or platform as a service and additional software as a service applications. Then over and above that, there's the element of what used to be just in case access in the traditional sense. Now we have instances where many people, whether it's our partners, whether it's our employees, they are rapidly getting privileged access to specific modules for certain critical components, which was not there previously. And then finally, we have the case of, in traditional cases, we had isolated privileged access, which was very clear and specific to business applications within the environment. Right now, however, because of the multiple environments, we are having a lot of integrated privileged access operations. So that means linking what is on-premise to what is on the cloud, to what is in other auxiliary systems. And all these elements pretty much provide a very big change in the environment that we work in. In addition to that, there's the point of the people we are working with, the kind of business models we are adopting. All of this are really driving a very significant demand or requirement on our thinking of a business continuity imperative that we have. Over to the next slide, please. Now, while all this is happening from a business point of view, there is what is happening in the technology spectrum, where we're talking about a lot of automation moving from just basic automation to intelligent automation. And in this particular case, we can almost group them into three particular classes, where there's a basic process automation, where we just talk about, rule-based activities that then can be performed by machines. Then there's a slightly enhanced version of that, where we talk about machines learning and being able to respond to certain kinds of problems. So things like chat boxes being in place, automated assistants, and basic natural language processing. And then there is the advanced version of that, where we're talking about cognitive automation, and this is the ability of technology to almost mimic thinking like a human being. Now, that's what is happening in the automation space. And with that, just next slide, please. With that, we are seeing a lot of disruption, whether it's in the ways that we are doing business because of this AI, cloud, technology capabilities, transforming everything, especially around security and operations ecosystems for our business continuity requirements. Now, you've heard of things like, sentiment monitoring, human vulnerability monitoring, incident detection, forensic analysis, and so on and so forth. All these are terms that you've had because of the disruptive capability of technologies like AI and the cloud. And then more importantly, in light of businesses trying to put themselves in a place where they're able to manage their business continuity concerns. Now, with that in mind, we ask ourselves, what's our duty as audit executives? And how can we respond to the intelligent automation capabilities that are happening around us with a view to make our businesses more resilient and able to continue despite the disruptions that we have? So there are three levels that I'd want us to consider this through. The first one is, as auditors and people who are charged with assurance services, there's the element of integrating governance and risk controls throughout the automation lifecycle. So remember, as the business is changing, as the technologies that are at our disposal within the organizations are taking over some of the activities in business, we as internal auditors have to be very, very aware of what those automation initiatives mean and be able to address the risks that are inherent in those automation initiatives. So I'll talk briefly about that, then we can talk about the opportunities that internal audit can push through in the business environment to embed automation capabilities. And finally, we'll talk about how the internal audit teams can capitalize on automation capabilities to be more effective and efficient in their activities. So from an automation risk universe considerations point of view, we have to think through some of the inputs that go into developing or managing the risk environment, the controls framework, and some of the risk areas that get addressed if we approach this requirement in a structured, well-intentioned manner. So you have your internal considerations that speak to your entire automation lifecycle, the governance, design, and deployment and operationalization of the automation initiatives. Then you have the external considerations that are driven by the regulations and the leading industry standards that my colleagues have mentioned previously. So you have your NIST framework, your ISO frameworks, and so on and so forth. So putting all these together into a controls framework that touches on entity level controls, technology risk controls, and the logic underlying some of the automation elements allows us to address the risk areas arising from inadequate oversight, inadequate knowledge of our staff and teams that are charged with executing these on a day-to-day basis. And finally, the security and privacy considerations that come with the low-level technology capabilities. Could be your bots, could be your automated processes, and so on and so forth. Next slide, please. So thinking through that, internal audit can help better assure any automation initiatives that are coming into play. Then secondly, we've talked about all these elements that are required of business continuity practitioners. So a lot of this require time and effort. And for us to be effective as business resilience practitioners, then we have to embed automation in some of the areas that we consistently review or assess. And this is where we talk about now setting up automated controls review environments. So you have to think about assessments, consistent reporting, looking into areas that can be of use to the business if we are able to automate. And then finally, having that continuous validation or assurance going on in the background allows the internal audit department and any other assurance-based teams to guarantee better or improved outcomes from the audit environment. And then finally, noting that these automation technologies are in some sense mature and have been tested in other domains, then as internal audit teams, we can leverage on that to deliver increased coverage in terms of how we monitor, assess, and give opinions on the business resilience capabilities. Then we are able to do maybe a little more granular analysis on specific aspects of the business. So for example, if you think about the fact that a lot of things have moved to the cloud and there's a lot of cognitive AI capabilities, things like business impact analysis can be driven by automated bots that do scenario analysis for you based on impacts and history of the organizational environment, which provides you with better understanding and better ways of planning for your business continuity capabilities. When you think about things like cognitive contract review bots, this allow you to review certain contracts with certain clauses with your partners, with your third parties, and you're able to identify risks that would impact your business continuity capability just because of improper usage of certain clauses. So thinking through how these mature automation capabilities can help you further reinforce your internal audit understanding is one of the key elements that I want us to take away from this session. And then quickly looking at some of the intelligent automation capabilities that can help, you may think of them as basic process automation. So we talked about business impact analysis being automated, assessments being automated, and that helps save some time in terms of this area. And then secondly, there's the enhanced automation where you rely on bots or organizational crawlers to just identify patterns, identify loopholes, do things like proactive threat detection because of a lot of data relying on machine learning. And then finally, you have your cognitive automation capabilities where we're talking about things like, the impact assessment that is done by an advanced bot. So you look at all the organizations of a particular type, the kind of response and expected timelines for those, and that gives you, better outcomes. So looking at that, then we have a whole suite of automated solutions, whether from a controls perspective and enhancing those controls in terms of being able to better your controls and assurance that you give. And finally, you get a broader perspective using this, because then a lot of time is spent on the high risk areas or areas that require higher order human judgments. So with that in mind, I'd like to stop here and open the floor to the Q&A section. Thank you. Thank you very much for that.
Thank you very much, Kevin, for your presentation. And thank you all presenters for your insightful presentation this morning. So at this point, we would like to open the session for Q&A. If you have any questions, there were a number of questions which were asked during the presentation, and I believe the presenters were able to cover those questions very much well. And at this point, from the Q&A session, I don't see any pending question. And so my ask to the CAEs is that if you have any burning question that you'd like to ask at this point, because we have 3 minutes or so in Q&A, because we don't want to keep you beyond the hour we had promised to finish this by 10:30. So if you have any comments to make, or if you have any burning question, please raise your hand and we can unmute you to ask that question live. And remember, David mentioned at the beginning of the session that if you'd like us to cover certain topics which are of interest to you as a CAE, because this is our forum as CAEs, remember to let us know. And we want to appreciate the contribution from David clearly in terms of the areas that you'd like us to look at. And he talked about cloud computing and data governance. So we will make arrangements of having such sessions in the future. And so, thank you. And so I can see we don't have any question at this point. So basically, just to thank all of you for taking time to attend the forum. It's always an honor and pleasure for us to host this forum and to give us a platform where as CAE we can interact, as CAE we can share or we can discuss some of the emerging topics in our space that apply to what we do on a day-to-day basis. And thank you all for taking time to attend. Today we have the highest participation in terms of the attendees. And so we want to take this opportunity also to thank you for setting aside time to spend time with us this morning. I believe and I hope that the session was very insightful. And this will put us into action as a CAE in terms of where we can partner in terms of in the area of business resilience, cyber, and the other topics that we have already covered in this session. And because I don't see any question and I don't see any hand raised, I would like to thank you all and request you that if you have any questions, if you have any comments, that you can write to us and we'll be able to respond. If you'd like us to have a session with you in regards to how this can be applied in your organization, or just to discuss around what is happening with your business, please also feel free to reach us out and we will be able to have that conversation. And because we don't have any questions so far, we are going to bring this session to an end. And to thank you all for your participation and to wish you a good day ahead.
Thank you.